everyone. Welcome to World Class Sunday School. I am Diann Morgan. Our Sunday School lesson for this study is initiating renewal. The term initiating means to start or to begin. And when you renew something, it means that it's been in existence before, but perhaps something happened to it. And as we go through our lesson, this time we'll find what happened to the city of Jerusalem. Our print passage is Nehemiah, the 2nd chapter, the 11th through the 20th verse. Our key verse is, "Then said I unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach." This is Nehemiah, the 2nd chapter, and the 17th verse. I'm going to give you a little background before we jump into the lesson, just so you can kind of get an idea of why Nehemiah has been given the responsibility of rebuilding the wall to the city of Jerusalem. So Israel at this time has been released from Babylonian captivity. Why were the Israelites in captivity in the first place? 1, disobedience. 2, worshiping idol gods. How many of you know that God is a jealous God and does not want us to worship idol gods? Even in the 10 Commandments, it tells us that we should not worship idol gods. And we should certainly not be disobedient. We're given the rules of how we should live, and God's expectation is that we will live by those rules and conduct ourselves like we are His child. So the Israelites did not learn their lesson from when they were freed from captivity by the Egyptians. Do you remember the story of God parting the Red Sea so they could cross over on dry land? Well, what happened after the people got there? Well, they began to murmur and to complain. Soon they made themselves another god, little g. They built this god out of gold that they collected among themselves, and they melted it down and they fashioned it into the shape of a cow. So they built themselves a small g god in the image of a golden calf. Of course this displeased God, but yet God continued to care for them. He fed them manna and quail from heaven as they traveled through the wilderness. He released water from a great rock to quench their thirst, because God yet loved them and He didn't want them to suffer. God also provided clouds by day to shelter them from the sun, and He provided stars and moonlight at night to light their path. Yet, when they arrived in the promised land, what did they do? They committed the ultimate sin. They began to worship idol gods. Now, how many of you all know God was not going to have that? They were blinded by the bling. But when they got to that promised land and they began to look at the women there, they began to look at treasures and jewels, and they forgot what God told them to do. God had made them a solemn promise, had given them clear instructions. But just as our parents do us, make us promises, give us clear instructions, they went astray. But God was yet merciful, and He was loving. He sent prophet after prophet to tell His people to get their act together. Much like when He told Noah to build the ark and tell the people, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain. But what did the people do? They made merry, they made fun of Noah, they kept partying hardy, until lo and behold, it began to rain, and it was too late. But the children of Israel, they just couldn't get their act together. They were still blinded by the bling bling, just as many of us are today. We are yet blinded by the glitter and glamour of this world. And this world is not our home, this world is not our friend. But yet we continue to turn our hearts from God, and we continue to chase after the bling of this world. But as hard-headed people are, the children of Israel did not heed God's many warnings. So what did God do? God pulled His hand back, and He allowed the Babylonians to capture them. However, God didn't totally remove his hand. God didn't just turn his back and forget about us and just leave us in a downtrodden state. He made provisions. So even while in bondage, God sent more prophets to tell them how to survive. He told them how to survive while they're in captivity, and he let them know that he had not forgotten about them, that he yet loved them. Just as if you're a parent, there are times when you might have to not do certain things for your kids, that sometimes you just have to say no. You have to deny them things because it's for their good. So this captivity period of 70 years was for their good. But as we go along, we'll find, even of today, we have not learned our lesson. So some might say, how can a loving God allow this to happen? But just think about it. There were times when your parents or you as a parent had to learn life's lessons the hard way. And oftentimes you might hear children say, hey, I want to make my own mistakes. Leave me alone. I want to do my own thing. And that's what we tell God. I want to make my own mistakes. Leave me alone. I want to do my thing. It's my thing. I want to do it. So that's what God did. He left them alone. And to their detriment, they fell captive to the Babylonians. So God has to exercise tough love with us. Just as sometimes as parents, you have to exercise tough love with your children. God wanted to make sure that his people knew that he had not forgotten them. So what did he do? He still provided prophets to tell them, hey, I still love you. I'm going to leave you in captivity for a while because I need you to learn to be obedient. I need you to stop worshiping idol gods. I need you to stop chasing after pagan women and pagan things and pagan men. I need you to remember who I am and whose you are. So this lesson that we have today takes place after the captivity has ended. God is sending more prophets with instructions for his people to be revived and restored. And just as I told you a little earlier, God didn't forget his people. He even in captivity, he continued to tell them by way of other prophets that I love you and that I am going to restore you. It may be a while longer because it's important that we learn these lessons so that we don't repeat them. So in last Sunday's lesson, we talked about Ezra, who was a prophet at that time. So Ezra was a prophet during the post-exile period, meaning that he was a prophet that came along after the children of Israel were released from Babylon. And he was instrumental in leading the Israelites out of captivity and rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed during the invasion of the Babylonians. Because the Babylonians were a warring people. They were a mighty warring people. When they attacked Jerusalem, Jerusalem was built with tall, thick walls and barriers to keep the enemy out. But that didn't stop the Babylonians. They had a lot of equipment, and they went in there and just utterly destroyed. They burned down the city, they pillaged it, they sacked it, they took the people captive, and they utterly destroyed it. It was barren when the Babylonians got finished. So the temple and the temple walls had been left in ruins. And it stayed in ruins for the whole period of the captivity. With the help of King Cyrus, the temple had been rebuilt, but the walls had not. So the city and the temple was still vulnerable to the enemies of the Jewish people, of the Israelites, because there was nothing to keep the Babylonians or the Assyrians or any other enemies out of the city of Jerusalem, or keep them from attacking that newly built temple. So remember, God still has a plan for how to protect his people. So now we're getting to today's lesson, and it's talking about Nehemiah. He was also a prophet during this time. This is the post-exile period. Remember I told you, after they have been freed from captivity. So Nehemiah held a prominent position in King Artaxerxes' court. He was the king's cupbearer, and he was a governor in Susa. Susa is where he was living. And to be a governor or a cupbearer of the king, you had to be someone that the king trusted. So therefore, he had favor with the king. So when God got ready for him to do the work of rebuilding the walls and securing the city, he made sure that Nehemiah would have whatever provisions he needed and protection. But as we should do when God gives us something to do and we accept that, we should first pray. So in Nehemiah, the first chapter, I wanted to read just a little bit of it, and then we'll talk about his prayer. Nehemiah said, "They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates have been burned with fire." So his brother Hanani had come to him with a report that the city was in turmoil, that it was a disgrace and a shame. Now, Nehemiah was actually born in Babylon, but he was born to Jewish parents. So he was born to parents who had come into captivity, but he was not one of those who had been initially there. He was a child that was born during the time of captivity. So when Nehemiah heard these things, he sat down and he wept. And for days he mourned and fasted and prayed before the Lord. And this was his prayer: "Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites committed, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commandments, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants. Be delighted and reverent in your name. Give your servant success today by granting him the favor in the presence of this man being the king, for I am the cupbearer of the king." Well, wasn't that a sincere, heartfelt, earnest prayer? I felt that prayer, and I wasn't present, but to just pour out yourself before the Lord and say, Lord, my brother has brought me word that my home city, I wasn't born there, but that's where all my ancestors came from, lies in ruin. And is asking God to give him what it would take to rebuild the wall. Because remember, the temple has already been built, but the temple is very sacred. And we want to protect the temple, the rest of the city, and his people from those who seek to do it more harm. Just think about if you were a child and you grew up in a certain neighborhood and you went back to that neighborhood and it seemed to lay in ruins. It would kind of hurt you. I think about, I grew up in North Memphis. I attended Northside High School, and there are times when I do go back to that area, and some of the houses don't look anything like they did when I was a child. You can see there's overgrown weeds, there are houses that need to be repaired. But I'm thankful that some renewal has come to the area. The old Hurt Village, the old Dixie homes, they made them into beautiful condominiums. So it's beginning to be improved. So that makes me feel good when I go there. So I understand how Nehemiah felt when he went back, when he received word that his homeland was in ruins. And Nehemiah understood that he needed protection to do what he needed to do, but first he needed permission, and he needed that permission from God to rebuild this wall, because the word had come to him, and it came to him for a reason, because he was going to be the person that God allowed to have charge of this. But more importantly, God had softened the heart of King Artaxerxes, who is a pagan king, but as I told you earlier, he has respect for Nehemiah. So it stands to reason that he has respect for Nehemiah's belief in his God. So our verses today, verse number 11, the second chapter of Nehemiah. So I came to Jerusalem and was there for 3 days. So he came to Jerusalem from the city he was living in, which was Susa. And when I did some study, it says this was about over 1,000 miles from where he came from. So he had come a long journey. It's not like he could fly in an airplane, ride on a train, ride in a car. He was riding on a beast. So when he got there, he had to rest for a while. He couldn't just start doing what he came to do because he needed to be focused. Verse number 12 says, Then I got up during the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the animal I rode. So he didn't come burdened down or heavy laden. He didn't bring a lot of people with him. He didn't bring a lot of animals with him. He didn't bring a lot of food or anything. He understood what he was there for. He had enough provision to do what he needs to do, but he didn't want to be hampered. Verse 13, I went out by night by the valley gate, past the dragon spring, and to the dung gate. The dung gate is said to be possibly where it was some type of dump or waste area. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. So the first thing he did once he rested was to look and see what the damage was. You can't repair something until you know what needs to be repaired. That's often what we have to do with ourselves. We have to look and see what the damage is. What harm did we bring to ourselves? What harm did we bring to our fellow man before we can seek to repair it, to ask God to restore it? So that's what Nehemiah is doing. He's doing just what God told him to do. Verse 14, Then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the animal that I was riding to continue. So if the animal can't continue, that means that Nehemiah has to do some walking. So he has to be prepared for that. He has to have what it takes to carry enough food to get him to where he needs to go and back to the animal. Next, number 15 says, So I went up by way of the valley by night and inspected the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate and so returned. So it doesn't really say that although he took a few people with him, it doesn't say that these few people accompanied him as he did his inspection. And if you notice, he did this by night. In doing research, I found out that possibly he was doing this in secrecy because he didn't want people to try to destroy his plan, to throw him off track, throw him off course. So he did it secretly because God had given him what he needed to do, and he didn't need people getting in his way. So it says Nehemiah's secret was necessary because he needed time to adequately determine what needed to be rebuilt. So he didn't need people, talking in his ear. He didn't need people telling him what their plan is. He needed to look at it and make a decision because God had given him the chore of deciding what needed to be done. And God was going to provide the necessities to rebuild it. But first he had to find out what needed to be rebuilt. So imagine how Nehemiah felt when he arrived in his home country. And I don't know that he's ever been there before because he was born during captivity in Susa, but I'm sure he'd heard the stories of how mighty Jerusalem was and how great the temple was that Solomon had built and how big the wall was and what great jewels had been were stored there. But all of that was gone. So I'm sure when he got there, he felt pain and hurt because his brother had told him what it looked like in that city. So let's travel on a bit to verse 16. It says, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest that were to do the work. So remember I told you there were other people there, but he needed time to think, time to look and time to inspect. And many times when we're doing God's work, we need time to think and reflect. You hear people going on sabbaticals because they need to study whatever it is that whatever assignment is that God has given them to do. They understand that they need some time to themselves. They need to think. And many times when you got this one saying something and another one saying something and disagreements break out, then it can throw all the plans off. And he didn't have a lot of time to do this. It's my understanding that the wall was rebuilt in 50 plus days, about 53 days. So that's not a lot of time. That's less than 3 months to do what God has told him to do. So God sent the right person to do it. He sent someone who's obedient, who was going to follow instructions, who had found favor with the king, and who was going to be provided for. But God was providing him with the people to do the labor. And it wasn't going to take a lot of people. If you remember, when God does things, he doesn't necessarily send a lot of people to do it. Remember the story of Gideon? Gideon started with a lot of people, and God was saying, no, get rid of this, get rid of these, get rid of these, until he got down to about 300 people. And Gideon was afraid that he wasn't going to be able to manage this, but God had it under control. Remember David fighting Goliath, a little puny fella who had some big, strong, strapping brothers? But God said, no, I'm going to send David because I'm going to equip him with what it takes to be successful. And that's what God did for Nehemiah. He equipped him with what it was going to take to be successful. So our Bible study, our Sunday school lesson says, Nehemiah kept his ideas about the project to himself and did not allow those who accompanied him to know his plans' full scope. And that is because God had already told him what to do. He had every confidence that God was going to give him what he needed to do. And then when it was time for the work, then he would be able to give them instructions on how to do it, and things would work out just fine. It says Nehemiah had already secured the promise of getting all the supplies that he needed for rebuilding the project, and the commission had been given to him by the king. And it is believed that God was in charge doing that work, that God had influenced King Artaxerxes to allow Nehemiah to go and inspect and rebuild, and to provide him with the supplies that would be needed. Because remember, I told you Artaxerxes was a pagan god, but he had a lot of trust in Nehemiah. It says Nehemiah's speech was an observance of the obvious, that the city's condition is one of horror. Because it says that Nehemiah was brokenhearted at it. So let's look at number 17 again. It says, then I say to them, you see the troubles we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins and the gates burned, which I've already mentioned to you. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we may no longer suffer disgrace. And although Nehemiah didn't grow up there, that's his homeland. That's his home country. That's where his forefathers lived. That's where his parents were born. So he felt sorrow at looking at what had happened to the ruins. But Nehemiah knew without any doubt whatsoever, and he trusted that God was going to give him the provisions, and he was going to be able to do it with the people that had been provided for him. He didn't have a huge work crew, but he had enough. He had the people who do the work. How many of you know sometimes you could be on your job and you got all these people and they all stand around not getting anything done, and then you choose a few and you can get it done in no time? Sometimes you're at church and you've got a project that needs to be done or a mission that needs to be taken care of, and you've got all these people who say they're going to help, but they don't show up. So God didn't have time for this. Nehemiah didn't have time for this. The people had suffered enough in bondage. So God was ready to restore their beautiful city. He had found the perfect person to do it in Nehemiah. So verse 18 says, I told them that the hand of my God had been gracious upon me, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. Then they said, let us start building. So they committed themselves to the common good. So they didn't argue with Nehemiah. They heard what he had to say. They trusted Nehemiah's God was going to make provisions for them, and that they would be able to get that wall restored, and they will be able to go in and rebuild the houses. So it says Nehemiah relays that he is favored by the hand of God, who has directed and inspired him. Oh, how beautiful it is that God inspired Nehemiah. God inspires me. And I truly pray that God inspires you. Look within your heart. Look within yourself and seek to see, does God inspire you? Many times we're inspired by other people. We may be inspired by Martin Luther King. We may be inspired by Steve Jobs. We may be inspired by President Obama or Michelle Obama, or maybe some singer or a poet or an actress or an actor. But God should inspire us above all things. It says, Nehemiah clarifies that he is serving as an instrument of God. He's letting everybody know he didn't do that alone. He didn't come on that one animal with those few people going inspecting the city in the dark of the night. He let them know it is God within me that is allowing me to do these things. So when you go out to do something major, take God with you. I don't care what it is. Take God with you every time. It says, God softened the heart of the king so that the work and the support to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem would be done. But how many of you know, when God has made provision, there's always going to be somebody who's going to try to throw it off. So here comes verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they mocked and ridiculed us, saying, "What is this that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" And number 20, then I replied to them, "The God of heaven is the one who would give us success, and we his servants are going to start building. But you have no share or claim or historic right in Jerusalem." So if you look at Nehemiah 2 and 10, even before these verses occurred, we already knew Sanballat and Tobias was going to be up to no good, because Nehemiah 2 and 10 says Sanballat and Tobias were very disturbed that someone was coming to the aid of the Israelites. So aren't we so happy that God sends people our way, sends people to aid us? It does us well to remember that and to know that God loves us beyond any measure that we could ever love ourselves. I truly hope you enjoyed the Sunday school lesson today. I did. It wasn't the easiest lesson to study for because there was a lot of history in it. But I thank you so much for listening to me. Brother Dorsey could not be here today, but he will be back next time. Thank you, and tune in again.